Now, we've seen Generation X and millennials, but the next could be Generation Lockdown. A new report from the International Labour Organization says there's a risk that young people's working lives will be permanently scarred by the coronavirus pandemic. It painted a dire picture of employment for youth. It found that more than 1 in 6 young people have stopped working since COVID-19 spread globally. And for those who are still going to work, their hours have been cut by 23%. Youth were particularly vulnerable to the crisis from the start. Nearly half were employed in the hardest hit sectors like tourism and hospitality. Well, for more on this, I'm joined by Guy Ryder, the Director General of the International Labour Organization. Hello there. Very many thanks for joining us on Euronews tonight. Guy, could you just put this into perspective for us? Youth are going to be particularly badly hit, but how long will they live with the repercussions of this? How bad will this be in the short term?
Yeah, I think the first thing to say is going into this pandemic, youth were already in a very, very vulnerable situation on labour markets. Global unemployment for young people was at 13.6%. That's higher than it was before the 2008 crisis. They never really got back from that. And they're also concentrated, as you've indicated, in sectors and in activities which have been highly affected by the pandemic's economic and social fallout. Now, in addition to those figures about job destruction for young people that you mentioned, can I draw attention to 2 other things which are affecting young people right now? One is the large-scale disruption of education. Education and training has ground to a halt as a consequence of the pandemic. In our survey work, half of young people say that they expect the acquisition of their qualifications to be delayed for an unsure but long time. 10% say they may never be able to get to the end of their courses. They'll simply be cut off from qualifications. So that's very worrying about skills acquisition. And the third thing that's happening is, what about those people arriving on the job market for the first time? It's always a tough process of transition from education to work. There's nowhere for them to go right now. In a lockdown situation, there's nowhere for them to go. And that's where the lockdown generation concept comes from. All of the evidence, all of past experience shows that if a young person is out of the labour market for a significant period of time at the beginning of their professional careers, they simply do not recover from that disadvantage. The disadvantage follows them in the trajectory of their professional career for decades. And this is, I think, the situation that we need to be alert to right now.
Guy, but we're talking about a lockdown that took place with several months. And if you look at the issue of education, you said of education being disrupted and vocal training, but a lot of that moved online. Was that not sufficient to salvage this situation?
Yeah, 2/3 of education and training taking place now, as you've said, migrated online. I think it's quite an impressive performance, but some people are getting left out of that. I think what we're seeing is, obviously, low-income countries which don't have the access to the necessary technology have not found it easy to make that migration. But even in the richer countries, in Europe, for example, we know that low-income households simply are not always equipped to take advantage of distance learning. So I think this hit is despite that move to distance learning, is really quite severe. And perhaps one further factor to add to this worrying equation is the evidence is that more than half of young people are now susceptible to acute anxiety and even depression. And this, of course, simply adds to the problems that we're talking about this evening.
OK, it's obviously a snowballing effect. And just very briefly now, you've said immediate action has to be taken. And if you look at the enormity of what you're describing, pinpoint for us what immediate action does need to happen.
Yeah, I mean, it's a great question, and there's no easy answer to it. I mean, from a European perspective in particular, we have in our memories the example of the European Youth Guarantee Schemes, which we had in a previous crisis of youth unemployment. I think this is a very good example of the type of schemes we need to put in place, because as we're trying to climb out of this pandemic's social and economic consequences, we simply cannot just put young people at the back of the queue. when everything else is sorted out, we'll look to them. They really do need to be put at the front of the queue because the likely consequences of inaction are going to be just simply too enormous for us to contemplate. So it's about priorities, it's about investment, and it's about big-scale action. It's been done before. Efforts have been made in this regard. We have to learn from it.
OK, put young people at the front of the queue. Well, Guy Ryder from the ILO, thank you.